Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to the conference. I'm very happy to be back here. I was visiting Haifa a few times earlier. I've been a great admirer of Professor Shmocha and other friends who I've also met here earlier. Now, I started my studies on the Middle East at the Norwegian Institute of Foreign Affairs in 1972, and I was on my first field work here in 1973. I happened then to meet with Teddy Katz, among others. Of course, I have followed this situation ever since. I'm a professor of international relations, and of course, this situation, the conflict, is certainly one of the most challenging in the international society. The reason why I started to be interested in this conflict, well, it's a long personal history, but I think basically to sum it up, it would be to say that as a European, I thought it was a duty of my generation to look back to the responsibility of the European responsibility for the Holocaust, but also for the European settler colonialism around the world. So that was the background for my generation. Well, I have only 20 minutes. I'm lecturing this over a whole semester often, but let me try to summarize a few points. And my luxury, of course, is that I'm an outsider. I'm an observer. It's easy for me to have opinions, or it's easy for me to present perspectives that does not have any effect to my immediate future. So this is indeed an outside view, and I'm humbled to be able to present them to peoples of this region. And there's already been a number of discussions about, the comparative perspective. What is this conflict a case of? There's also been some discussion about power sharing. And the kind of comparative perspective that I think is most reasonable to apply. And that is always a discussion. What is this a case of? I wrote an article in the Journal of Theoretical Politics. It was called "The Frontier State at Work." So Israel is, in my opinion, the last European frontier state. We have seen very many different outcomes of these frontier conflicts, as in Australia, the United States, South Africa, etc. And every case is unique, which is very important, but introducing these other cases, also if it is Cyprus and Northern Ireland, and Ian Lustig's analysis of Algeria and Northern Ireland case, I think was very important also. That was the point of departure for my article in the Journal of Theoretical Politics. Anyway, the particular challenge is, when we are talking about power sharing, is that, well, the power sharing must be between a defined population on a defined territory. So since I have only 20 minutes, I don't have time to go into the presumptions and the theoretical discussions too much, but let me just very briefly present this table before I will conclude with a second. When it comes, and the point of departure for this figure here is a discussion I had with Arend Leipart, who is a very well-known Dutch-American professor of political science, and he invented the concept of consociationalism. That is, power sharing in deeply divided societies. And he discussed the relationship between consociationalism, which is in the middle there to your left, between that one and majoritarian systems, Westminster democracy. I introduced in 1988 the concept of ethnocracies. That is, in cases where you have ethnically defined states and with constitutional or legal mechanisms and state machinery that guarantees that one group is the dominant group in the state. So these are the three constitutional principles, that is singularism when one group is dominating. The pluralism is when you have different groups sharing power on the basis of groups. And the third is universalism, where it's based on one person, one vote. So we don't have to go into all these alternatives, but my question is, my presumption is that Israel is an ethnocracy, and that somehow in a power sharing solution would have to imply that some solution under that line of singularism, in order if you want a democracy. And there are lots and lots of possibilities, of course, for moving from a non-democratic, ethnocratic solution. Baruch Kimmeling has defined Israel and the occupied territories as Israeli control system. So it's a question: how do you share power in the Israel control system? It could be one state, could be 2 states, 3 states, multi-states, it could be confederations, all these possible things. And so, but you have to be specific and concrete. And we have today, for the most part, we have discussed the situation between the people, the Israeli Jewish people within the state of Israel, and the Palestinians in the occupied territories. That is the Oslo framework, basically. Particularly the Oslo II agreement, which split up the occupied territories in different zones and different status areas. Now, as also have been said earlier today, that each of these demographic group, if it's the Jewish diaspora, the Yishuv, the Jews in the settlements, then you have what is in the Zionist framework would be the Jewish people. And the dynamic of the situation is that Israel, as a frontier state, the settlement faction of these people is increasing on the expense of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And that's creating lots of conflict dynamics. And the Oslo Agreement was a way in which one tried to find a solution to particularly that situation and to fit in a Palestinian political entity into the Israeli control system. It was not a question of dismantling the ethnocratic system of Israel. It's very asymmetrical. I mean, the whole thing was how to establish a Palestinian entity that is acceptable to Israel within the existing presumptions within the Israeli society and the Israeli political leadership. So it doesn't touch really the question of power sharing other than power sharing within the dominant Israeli control system. And that's also why it was so important for the Israelis in Tunis or elsewhere to say, refugees, no, never back. Because that would challenge the demographic character of Israel and as a Jewish state as it understood as a Jewish state. I mean, an alternative, and the problem here is that one reason, I think, why it is so difficult to fill the gap between the declaration of principles and the practical solution is because there are so different ideas of peoplehood. The Zionist Israeli conception of peoplehood is, like Golda Meir said, that Israel is where the Jews are. I mean, it's the Jewish people in totality that is the demos, the fundamental demos of the State of Israel, whereas the Palestinian demos basically is the Palestinian people, that is the 20% of the Israeli population, on the top there, you see, and the Palestinian in the occupied territories, and the refugees. And the Declaration of Principle is an agreement between the State of Israel representing, well, this Zionist conception and the Jerusalem program, the Jerusalem program of 1968, stating the aim of Israel is the ingathering of the exiles, and the PLO, which represents the entire Palestinian people. And these two concepts of peoplehood there's nothing in the Oslo process and Oslo agreements that where this gap can be met. So that is really where the historical compromise will have to be addressed, as I see it from the outside. That, well, Israel, could it be established as an Israeli state, not as a Jewish state, but as a territorial state, not as an ethnic state, but as a territorial state? I think that is, sooner or later, that has to be the foundation of a historical compromise. And one could, of course, consider that what are comparable here, the law of return in Israel and the right to return on the Palestinian side, are those fundamentals somehow comparable, and how could one make a historical compromise between those two? They're also very different, of course, because the refugees have a foundation in international law and in basic human rights. I mean, whatever the reason you have become a refugee after a war, you, of course, as a basic human right, you have the right to return. But, of course, that would have enormous implications of the idea of the Jewish state as understood in the foundation of the State of Israel. But, so of course, it's understandable why it is so difficult to communicate across this barrier of conceptions of what kind of polity this territory should be, because that is, I mean, the real question here. So, who constitutes the demos of the territory, and what territory? I mean, that was not decided in Oslo I, but what happened in the 1995 Oslo II agreement, which was the practical implementation of Oslo I in one sense, was the ethnic division of the occupied territories, which is, unfortunately, as I see it, the foundation of a kind of apartheid state if that continues, and if the parties do not find a common ground to define the territory and the demos. So, and I also agree with who's ever said that, you know, there could be suddenly a breakthrough. I mean, who believed that the white minority regime in South Africa would actually accept a new constitution and a democratic constitution of South Africa? There were some resistance, as has been indicated here, with the idea of an Urania to be established as a white state within South Africa, but that wasn't sustainable, of course. So leadership here, I think, is extremely important. And I think the Oslo Agreement testifies to the importance of visionary leadership on both sides. So, and the question then, you know, of course, in the history of Israel, we also know that there have been voices to the extent that one should have not an ethnic state, but a territorial Israeli state. So that is not impossible, as I see it. And I think it's interesting things also going on within the Palestinian Arabs living in Israel. You have the Haifa Declaration, you have the Vision document a few years ago, which created some discussions, I think, both on the Arab and the Israeli side. But it's important that this minority also clarifies its position both as Israeli and as Palestinians. They represent a critical demographic element, I think, in the future discussions, which will come up sooner or later on this power sharing. This is, I think, in very briefly, lots of arguments behind it, which I don't have time to go into, but I hope I have been able to present just a kind of an outside view, and I urge that people are as specific as possible when it comes to what do we discuss in terms of which of these groups and which claims do they have. I mean, the Palestinians in Israel, equal rights. The Palestinians in the occupied territories get rid of the occupation. The Palestinian refugees, the right of return. There are different aspects. And as we have already heard, the settlers have their interest, the Yishuv have their interest, the diaspora have their interest. So we have to be very specific when we discuss these claims of self-determination. That's all I had to say. Thank you.